Okay, so good day to everyone. Today we're going to discuss part 3 of module 1 of CA 2131. And we're going to be discussing weathering and the earth processes. Okay, so before we start, I will have to ask you, have you ever thought of why are the beach stones and rocks smooth? Or why are the sands found along the shoreline so fine or very small? Or how are caves or canyons formed? Or how was this formation even possible? How did this happen? So have it ever crossed your mind to think how was the mountains, how was caves, or how were the beaches formed? So the answer of that would be what we call your earth processes, or what we call the geologic processes. So the geologic process will have two categories. So the first one is what we call your endogenous process, and the other one is what we call your exogenous process. So what is the difference between the two? So when we say endogenous processes, from the word endo, meaning it is within or inside. Okay, so this is also known as hypogenic process. So this process now would usually happen or originate within or inside the Earth's crust or below the surface of the Earth. So the endogenous process would mainly be affected by the movement of magma under your crust. So it's affected or caused by the thermal energy in the mantle that affects the crust, and this thermal energy would be derived from radioactive elements found in the mantle and the gravitational differentiation that happens also in the mantle. So example of what happens when there is an endogenous process are your earthquakes, your tectonic movements, and your volcanism. Okay? So basically, under endogenous process, ang nangyayari dito is there is creation or development of landforms. Okay? While for exogenous processes, from the word exo, okay, it is now a process that would happen at the surface or outside the crust of Earth. So exogenous process would also be called as epigenic process, wherein this is a process that is caused by external forces or external origins. So the energy now that would produce or will make exogenous process will be derived from external sources such as your sun, the heat of the sun, wind, water, and all other external processes. Okay? So exogenous process would now include degradation and gratification of the earth or of the soil. This would also include weathering, deposition, and erosion. For exogenous, so if endogenous now create disparities or develop new forms, exogenous now would eliminate inequalities in Earth surface. So basically, endogenous process could be classified as a constructive process of Earth, while exogenous process would be classified as a destructive process along the way. Though along the way of that destructive process, there's also some parts that are creating some force. But more or less, yung creation ng landforms natin is may kasamang elimination or destruction. Okay? So to understand the different processes of geology, we now start off first with the exogenous processes. So the first one is what we call weathering. So what is weathering? So basically, weathering is the breakdown of rocks or land formations on the Earth's surface under the influence of different agencies, which are either physical or chemical in process. Okay? So weathering now will have three processes along the way. This will now include disintegration, decomposition, and denudation. While for the process of weathering, the breakdown of rocks or of soils on Earth will now be affected by different factors. So these factors now would basically include yung nature ng rock ninyo. So is the rock brittle? Is the rock hard? So depending on its properties, yung tagal ng pag-breakdown at kung gaano kalaki yung pag-weather or pag-disintegrate ng rocks ninyo. So aside from the nature, another factor would be the length of time. So the more time it is exposed to a certain agent, physical or chemical agent, then there's will be the effect kung gaano kalaki or ano yung mangyayari na formation. Okay? So another factor would be your climate. So basically, these three factors will be hand in hand in contributing to the disintegration, the breakdown of the rock formations or your land formations. Okay? So under weathering, so the processes now that we have mentioned, the disintegration would basically be from the word disintegrate. This is a process simply of breaking up into smaller pieces by physical agents. So disintegration meaning there is no chemical change in the process. So nadudurog lang or nahahati-hati yung mga rocks ninyo in disintegration. For decomposition, this is now the process of breaking up, but what we change here is not the physical components or the physical properties of the rocks, but instead what is changed throughout decomposition or what helps in the breakup is the change in the mineral constituents or the chemical constituents of the or composition of the rock. And the last process is what we call your denudation, which is used with as a term when Earth's surface is worn away by chemical and mechanical actions. So basically, denudation now will be a combination of disintegration and decomposition. And the denudation usually happens on lower layers of the Earth. Okay? So, to understand the different types of weathering, okay, and the processes that we have mentioned, let's start off first with the first type, which is what we call physical weathering. So physical weathering is also called as mechanical weathering, which is simply the breakdown of your mass or your objects under the effect of wind or water or other external forces. Okay? So, in physical weathering, your rocks would now be broken gradually into smaller and irregular fragments and into smaller dimensions. And from the word physical, the change now or the breakdown is, or the process for physical weathering will be your disintegration. So, mechanical or physical property lang yung napapalitan sa kanya. Yung kulay niya, yung size niya, yung bigat niya. Okay? So, yun lang yung napapalitan pag physical weathering. So as the rocks now would disintegrate, properties of it would also change, or physical properties will change. That's for physical weathering. One important component or component that would affect physical weathering is your temperature. Since physical weathering will be most active in cold and dry and higher areas of the Earth's surface, because there is usually a higher change in temperature there. Okay, so the temperature changes will be the one responsible to your physical weathering. Okay, next type of physical or of weathering is what we call your chemical weathering. So from the term chemical, the breakdown is caused by the chemical decomposition of the rock, meaning the internal structure is changed through addition or removal of elements by chemical reaction. So addition, so pwedeng nagkaroon siya ng chemical reaction sa water, so nagbago yung kanyang chemical composition. So it's an example of chemical weathering. Okay? So usually, chemical weathering will take place in presence of water, which could dissolve active gases from the atmosphere. Okay? So conditions usually are defined primarily by the chemical composition of rocks, humidity, and the environment surrounding the rock which is under breakdown. So kung sa physical weathering, what affects the disintegration or the breakup is the temperature. Chemical weathering will be affected primarily by the presence of water. Okay? So aside from physical and chemical weathering, we also have what we call the biological weathering, which is simply caused by organisms, so living organisms or dating living organisms such as fungi and small animals or plants. Okay, so these organisms now would contribute to the weathering by the constant rubbing and carving of soil as they tunnel underground. So as they go through the ground and meet some soils or rocks, these organisms now would be creating mechanical or physical weathering if their effects will be just physical change. Okay? But if these organisms now causes change in chemical structure or chemical composition, then it is now what we call bioweathering, which is under chemical weathering. Okay? So to understand the two types of weathering, let's have some examples of them. So under physical weathering, we have your freeze-thaw stress, or also known as frost weathering or cryo-fracturing. So what happens in freeze-thaw stress? So basically, our rocks or your soils will have some pores or cracks in it. So what happens? Liquid now will seep through the cracks or the openings, and then at very low temperature, the liquid or the water that have seeped through the rock freezes. Okay? And once it has freeze, what will happen? So when ice or water freezes at very low temperature, water now expands. And as it expands, it will now act as a wedge, and it will now widen up the crack until the rock splits or breaks. Okay? And then, when ice melts into liquid water, it will now gather the small particles from the rock or the split rock and then it will now erode and carries it along the way. And then this will happen again if there are more other cracks in the rock. So water will again seep through, freeze, and then make the crack bigger until the rock splits again into a smaller particle. Okay? So example of freeze-thaw stress is this one. So this is a very big boulder. So dati magkadikit yan. But because of freeze-thaw stress, so nakita natin naghiwalay na siya. Tapos we could also see some other parts wherein it is splitting up. Okay? So freeze-thaw, ibig sabihin lang, nag-freeze, tapos nag-expand, tapos nawala yung tubig, and then cycle again. Water comes in, freezes, makes the split or the crack bigger, and then cycle will happen again until it basically breaks the material. Okay? So another physical weathering is your thermal stress. So for thermal stress, this is a process wherein the temperature changes now contribute to mechanical weathering. So almost similar to your freeze-thaw stress. So the changes in temperature now would cause rocks to either expand or contract. So basically, if we have higher temperature, the material would get bigger. Pag malamig, nagko-compress. So, paulit-ulit na heat, cold, expansion, contraction, then this will now weaken the structure or the property of the rock. And when this happens continuously, it will now be able to split up or break down into smaller pieces. Example of rocks that would experience thermal stress would be those rocks found on your desert. So they are very vulnerable to thermal stress. So this is another example of thermal stress. So ito, walang water na included sa kanyang breakdown. It's just simply the temperature getting very high and very low continuously. Okay? So another example of physical weathering is what we call the exfoliation. So exfoliation will now contribute to the formation of Barnhards, which is a kind of land formation, which is formed through weathering and erosion. So what happens in exfoliation? This is now due to the difference in pressure from the uplift of rock. So this comes from the pressure below the rock. Okay? So overlying materials will now be removed through unloading because of the pressure that is lifting the rock upwards. So underlying rocks would now expand and will release pressure, and the rock surface will be vulnerable to sheeting. So ang nangyayari dyan, this is an example of a landform experiencing exfoliation. So nakikita nyo yung mga ito. So para siyang mag-slide pababa. So ito yung sheeting na nangyayari. So because there's pressure underground, so natutulak niya yung nasa taas. So pag tinulak mo, 'di ba, pag naka-enclose, pag may naka-enclose doon sa isang object, tapos yung nandoon sa loob is nagbibigay ng pressure, so natutulak niya yung parang layer sa labas. So pag nasobrahan yung pressure sa loob at hindi na kayanan ng layer, covering layer, so magbre-break or bibiyak yung layer nyo outside. And when that happens, that is now what we call the exfoliation of, or exfoliation na physical weathering. Okay? So other examples of physical weathering would include what we call haloclasty. So this will now be in relation to salt water. So para siyang sa freeze-thaw, pero instead of yung normal water, salt water yung pumapasok doon sa crack and pores ng rocks ninyo. And when that happens, during evaporation, so yung tubig mawawala, pero yung salt mag-i-stay doon sa rock. And pag laging nangyayari na mayroong salt water na pumupunta doon sa ating rock, nag-iipon yung salt ninyo, giving pressure to it. Okay? So another example is honeycomb, which is also related to haloclasty. So this will now be formation with hundreds of pits that is formed by the growth of salt crystals. So, di ba sa haloclasty naiiwan yung salt doon sa pores or sa crack ninyo. So, pag nalagyan ng tubig, yung salt magde-dissolve, makukuha ulit pag nag-flow yung tubig. And yung parang kinain ng salt na part ng rock will now form parang butas-butas, which looks like a honeycomb. Okay? Another one is the salt upwelling, which is almost like haloclasty. Only for salt upwelling, this will now happen underground. Okay? So this one is an example of honeycomb weathering. Okay? So may nag-grow na salt crystal dyan because of haloclasty, and then it was removed probably by wind or by water. So nung natanggal yung salt doon sa rock formation, nagkaroon na siya ng mga honeycombs or ng mga large pores on its surface. So that's for physical weathering. So under chemical weathering, we have what we call your carbonation. So the carbonation is simply a process wherein carbon dioxide from the air would now combine with water. So air or soil combines with water. And what happens? There will now be a carbonic acid produced. And that carbonic acid now dissolves your rocks or rock formations. So, most effective ang carbonic acid in dissolving limestones, which can open up cracks or hollow out vast networks of caves. So, because of carbonation and the dissolution of limestone materials, nagkakaroon tayo ng mga canyons or ng mga caves ninyo. So, this is now a picture of a limestone cave which was formed through carbonation. And this is found in New Mexico. Another example of chemical weathering is through oxidation. So through oxidation, this will now work mostly on rocks or rock formations that contain ferrous or iron. So basically, when iron reacts together with oxygen, there will be a formation of rust. So the rocks now would turn to rust through oxidation. So oxidation will happen whenever the ferrous or ferric rock will be interacting with water. Okay? So di ba yung bakal ninyo, basta pag it's made up of or it has iron element in it, so basta nabasa, nagkakalawang siya. So that's also the same thing that happens to rocks that will contain or composed of irons. So the expansion of the rust throughout your rock formations will weaken it, and once weakened, it will now be liable for the breakup of rock. So this is an example of an oxidized rock. So nakita nyo, because of oxidation, naging reddish yung kulay niya. So usually, rocks with iron ore of red color or almost red color. So, nung nabasa, nagkaroon ng oxidation, humina, kaya nagkaroon ng breakdown. Okay. Another chemical weathering is hydration. So, for hydration, this is now a process wherein chemical bonds of minerals would change with the interaction of water. Okay? So, when mineral anhydrite reacts with water, it is transformed into gypsum, which is the most common mineral on Earth. Another chemical weathering is hydrolysis, wherein there's a formation of a new solution or mixture as chemicals interact with water. An example of this will be sodium minerals that is formed through a salt water solution. Okay, so example of hydration will be your wave rock. So this was created because of the interaction of water in the rock. Okay. So that's for chemical weathering. And the last example of chemical weathering is decay. So living or once living organisms would act now as chemical agents of weathering. So what happens in decay? So the remains of the plants or some fungi will now form carbonic acid. And so ang diniscuss natin, carbonation, if there's carbonic acid, it will now weaken and dissolve your rock. Okay, so basically, mga organic materials. Okay, pag may carbon. So any organic material that will be interacting with your rocks could cause decay or cause formation of carbonic acid. Okay, some bacteria would weather rocks to access nutrients such as magnesium or potassium. So, yung ibang bacteria, hindi naman siya nagde-decay doon sa rock, pero ang ginagawa ng bacteria is that it gets the nutrients, the elements, or minerals inside the rock. So, when it gets those minerals, it changes the chemical composition of rocks. And when it happens, there will now be breakup or weathering. Okay, so this is an example of a rock that is covered with fungi. Okay, so this is now, so pag covered na ng fungi yung isang rock, it is now under weathering. Okay. So for biological weathering, this will now include the process or involvement of living things. So we have plant roots on this first picture. So as you can see, the plant now grows through the cracks, and as it grows, it will now split it open. Other biological activity that would affect weathering. So we have microbial activity. So there's fungus with moss that would grow on a rock, causing weathering. So also we have animals. So as animals such as rabbit would dig their burrows, they will be hitting some rocks, thus breaking it along the way. And one of the most intelligent beings that would cause biological weathering will be humans. So because of human activities, sometimes they cause either chemical or physical weathering. So an example of that would be mining. Okay? So as humans mine through underground, so they are changing the properties of the rocks, of the soil layer underground. Tapos kung gumamit pa sila ng chemicals in the mining process, then there could be some changes in mechanical or in the chemical composition of the layers or of the rocks found at the bottom or underground the earth. Okay? So other exogenous process, this will now, aside from weathering, this will now be caused by wind and water. So by wind, we have what we call erosion or wind erosion. So under wind erosion, we have two types of wind erosion. The first one is what we call deflation, wherein this is now the process of the wind by removing the loose material from flat areas and uncemented sediments. So yung mga buhangin, dust, sa flat area, so pag nilipad yon, so nawawala yung mga loose materials nyo, loose rocks or sediments, then it is under deflation. So this usually occurs in deserts, dry lake beds, floodplains, and glacial washout plains. The second type of erosion by wind is what we call abrasion. So under abrasion, ang nangyayari dito is that the wind, as it carries loose materials around, those loose materials now will be scraping or rubbing against other rock surfaces throughout its movement. And through the scraping, so ang nangyayari, nababawasan yung mga ibang rock formation. So in the diagram, so the upper diagram figure is a figure that would explain deflation. So nasa taas merong small particles. So liliparin yan ng hangin. And in the long run, pag nilipad to, mawawala lahat nung nasa ilalim. So anong nangyari? Pakonte or paliit ng paliit yung layer ng soil ninyo. Pero meron pa ring maliliit. So, ililipad ulit. Hanggang sa wala nang mailipad na smaller or loose material doon sa pavement ninyo o doon sa ground ninyo. Okay? So, abrasion naman. So, ito, habang nililipad, nagde-deflate yung mga materials natin. Habang dumadaan siya dito, nag-scrape siya. So, parang sinasandpaper niya yung nandito sa ilalim. So, as we can see from this figure, mas maraming loose particles na nalalagay or na dumadaan dito sa ilalim kaysa doon sa upper portion. That's why what happened is that on the lower portion, mas mabilis yung kanyang pag-scrape. Okay, so that's for erosion. Another one is by transportation. So for transportation, this is now a process by wind wherein the sediments will be carried away by the wind. So this is now divided in two. We have the bed load, which is the particles carried by the wind which are larger and heavier. So, mas malapit siya doon sa bed o doon sa pinakababang portion. So, this will be larger, heavier particles and usually, they will be lifted not more than 30 to 60 centimeters from the Earth's surface. And the other one is what we call the suspended load, which will be those that can be carried by the wind higher. So, mga dust particles. Okay? So, ito yung sa suspended, sa bed load. So, pag nilipad sila, so through transportation, may nangyayari din na erosion. So, basically, magkasama ang erosion saka transportation ninyo. So, example of transportation. So, smaller particles will be blown higher. And then, larger particles or the bed load will be those that are near the ground. So, yung hindi masyadong maitulak ng or mabuhat ng wind. So, that's for transportation. So, through transportation, natatanggal yung mga particles ninyo sa baba. So, that is yung una nating nasabi, which is erosion by deflation. So, the next process that is caused by wind is what we call deposition of sediments. So, deposition, meaning from the word deposit. So, sediments now are deposited by air or by the wind. So, how are they deposited? The sediments are dropped and deposited to the ground or to other surfaces, which are now known as aeolian deposits. So, we have different types of deposits. The first one is your sand dunes, which can either be a Barcan dune or a transverse dune or longitudinal dune. So basically, sa Barcan dunes, yung wind natin, naglo-blow doon, tapos nagfo-form siya ng parang moon shape na area. Ang transverse naman, ito yung wind ko, tapos yung nafo-form na land formation is perpendicular to the direction of the wind. While for longitudinal, ito, yung parang hati niya is perpendicular or is parallel to the direction of the wind. Okay? So aside from sand dunes, we also have your lowest, which are loosely compacted sediments, which are yellowish to grayish or brownish in color, and they are wind-blown, and they will now be gathered into a certain spot, and they will now be forming some landforms. So, example of your lowest are these figures. So, ito, na-form siya because of the wind blowing the sediments through it. So, nablo-blow siya, or nadadala siya ng hangin, tapos, because of the wind also, it is compacted also by wind and other forces, kaya nabubuo yung ating mga lowest layers. Okay? So, aside from wind, there is also processes of formation that is caused by water. So, also, same as for wind, it will also have the same process. Iba lang yung kanyang agent. So, for erosion, so basically, this will now be detachment and transport of soil by water instead of wind. So, this could be natural or facilitated by human activity. There are 4 types of erosion under geology, which is inter-reel erosion and reel erosion. So, basically, ang difference lang nila, so it's the impact of rainwater. So, yung inter-reel, pagpatak ng tubig sa lupa, 'di ba? Pag may loose material doon sa lupa, pag may pumatak na tubig, tumatalsik yung ibang parts ng tubig together with the smaller particles. Yung reel erosion naman would be the runoff shear force. So, merong dumadaloy dito, nagfo-flow na water. And as water flows, it gathers now the loose particles on the soil. So, pag mas marami yung loose particle and mas marami yung flow ng water, so mas malaki yung erosion natin. Okay? So, another one is what we call your bank erosion. So, this is simply the wearing away of banks of a stream or a river. So, this is cause. So, nag-erode yung lupa ninyo doon sa gilid because of the water. And then, lastly, we have the gully erosion, which is the removal of soil along drainage lines by surface water runoff. So, basically, for inter-reel and reel erosion and gully, medyo related sila. So, pag masyadong malakas na yung reel erosion ninyo, it could now develop into a gully erosion. Okay? So by transportation of water, this will now be soils being transported through flowing water. So we have 3 under transportation. This will now be your dissolved load. So this will compose of ions in the solution. So, and usually carried in the water all the way through the ocean. We also have your suspended load. So ito yung mga smaller particles na hindi kayang ma-dissolve pero super liit kaya kaya pa rin siyang tangay ng flow pero nandun siya sa bandang taas ng water surface ninyo. Okay? So the particles that can be carried away will be determined by the velocity of the stream. And then the bed load, same condition as for transportation by wind. Ito yung particles na malalaki, kaya medyo nasa ilalim naman siya ng stream bed or river bed ninyo. Pero natatransfer pa rin siya. So to understand that, we have this, for example. So may particles tayo na lupa sa ilalim. Tapos pag nagkaroon ng wave or movement of water, so yung mga maliliit na particles na andun siya sa taas. Yun yung suspended load ninyo. So it will flow all throughout. Pag yung bed load naman, dito lang siya sa baba nag-move. Okay? So this is another video. So yung smaller particles or yung bigger particles, dito siya sa baba nag-flow. So this is another one. So as you can see, pag nag-transport ng soil, yung tubig, yung mas malaki, natutulak niya, pero pag alis, naiiwan na. Ang nadadala lang will be the smaller particles pabalik. Okay? Next is deposition of sediment by water. So this will be happening as heavier particles will be deposited first on the surface as water loses energy. So, parang yung last picture natin sa previous slide. So, under deposition of sediments, there will now be formations of delta. So, the sediments and silt will now be deposited and formed by rivers in the lower course right at the point where they enter the sea. So, yung parang meet-up point ng river at ocean, yung formation sa part na yon are your deltas. Then we have your sandbars, so or also known as offshore bar. These are now submerged or partly submerged ridges of sand by the beach. So ito. So ito yung deposition. And then we have the beaches. So forms when wave deposits sand and gravel along the shoreline. That's for deposition. For endogenous process, we'll now have 3. The first one is magmatism. This is when the emplacement of magma within and at the surface of outer layers of terrestrial planet happens. So magma will now solidify as an igneous rock. And magma forms between temperatures of 800 to 12,000 degrees Celsius. So what happens in magmatism? So we have here a simple diagram of our layers. So we have here your mantle. So ito yung lithosphere natin, yung crust, and then upper portion of the mantle, and then we have the atmosphere. So what happens? At the mantle, there will be partial melting of the magma. So dito nag-originate yung magma. So nagme-melt siya. Pag nag-melt, what will happen? Magma will now rise as it finds cracks through the surface or the mantle. So it rises, and then at this part now, between the mantle and the crust, there will now be intrusion. Papasok na siya, magiging intruder na. So once it intrudes, there will now be, so di ba mainit to, dito hindi na siya mainit. So magkakaroon na ng crystallization or solidification. And when that happens, magma now will be moving through or towards magma reservoirs And pag masyadong active pa rin yung nasa ilalim, what will happen next is there will be volcanic eruption. So, extrusion na, lalabas na yung lava ninyo. So, yung magma nasa ilalim, yung lava yung lumalabas sa volcano. So, that's for magmatism. So, our rocks will now be formed on these areas. So, as the magma rises up, it cools down. So, there's formation of landforms. So, same din dun sa pinakita ko sa mid-Atlantic ridge, diba? Pag tumaas yung magma, it cools down, so it creates new crust. So, that's also magmatism. Okay? Next endogenous process is the volcanism. So, any various process that would involve discharge of molten rocks, your lava, pyroclastic fragments, or hot water and steam. So, there are two types of volcanism under geology. We have intrusive volcanism, wherein magma cools and solidifies underneath the surface. And we have extrusive volcanism, wherein the magma will cool and solidify once it has exited the Earth's surface. So, this one are examples of your intrusive and extrusive volcanism. So, basically, dito na yung formation ng igneous rocks also for intrusive and extrusive. We'll be discussing this more on the later topics. And the last process under endogenous is what we call metamorphism. Okay? So, this is simply the alteration. So, metamorphosis. So, magmomorph siya. So, it changes into different composition or structure by heat, pressure, or other natural agents. So, there are two types of metamorphism. We have contact metamorphism and regional metamorphism. So, for contact, this will simply be due to the change in temperature. So, because of heat. So, contact metamorphism usually happens near the magma chamber or doon sa mainit na portion ng mantle ninyo sa yung paakyat sa volcano. So, dito nangyari ang contact metamorphism. While for regional metamorphism, from the word region, metamorphism or the change happens as a group or in a large scale. So, usually, yung regional metamorphism natin will happen on your convergent zones. So, pag merong nagkakaroon ng bagong mountains. So, that is an example of regional metamorphism. Your mid-Atlantic range forming new crust is also an example of regional metamorphism. Okay? So, that's for the different processes. So, what is now the importance of knowing what is rock weathering? So, one of the importance would include will be able now to select suitable quarry area for extraction of stones for our structural and decorative purposes. So, kung alam ko kung saan banda nagfo-form yung mga ganitong klaseng material, then I will be able to locate or produce now yung kailangan kong dami, quantity, and quality. So, weathering would always cause a loss in the strength of rocks or soils. So, if your area is a site wherein weathering usually happens, then it will now affect your project. Kasi, pag may weathering, ibig sabihin, mahina yung rock or yung soil, yung rock bed nung area na yon. So, kailangan ko ulit pag-aralan yung aking foundation plan or foundation design. So, as a construction engineer, it is always necessary for you to see the extent of the area which is under consideration for your project which is affected by weathering. Kasi nga, affected yung ating base or yung ating foundation. So also, you should always see the possible effects of weathering processes in your area on your construction materials. So kung yung area ninyo is may laging naapektuhan ng, let's say, oxidation, so madaling mag-rust, so maapektuhan yung material natin. So what will you do if you really want to build your project on that site? So you have to coat or cover your material with anti-rust or anti-oxidizing agents. Okay? So for our engineering consideration in general, no site is selected for any type of important work on moving dunes because such dunes are always a source of trouble. So bakit hindi tayo naglalagay sa dunes? So pag sa dunes kasi 'di ba laging may movement of loose particles because of sand. So remember, yung ating abrasion saka ang ating deflation. So kung lagi yon, baka mangyari natatabunan na yung project ninyo. So kung gusto mo talaga dun magpatayo, so kailangan mo ulit magbigay ng engineering consideration na kailangan kong i-block yung movement ng sand. Okay? So moving dunes also would damage certain important works. So yung mga mga bakal ninyo kung hindi pa na semento or yung semento, yung concrete ninyo. So pwede pa rin siyang mas creep ng moving sands ninyo because of the dunes. Okay? So if you are compelled to select sites such as dunes, special methods now should be adopted to check the motion of your moving sand dunes. Okay? So that's for weathering and the earth processes. So I'll be posting this week your Google form in the classroom for part 1 and 2 and part 3 of module 1. So if you still want to read more on weathering, you can always check on these references. Thank you for listening.